Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in today's one we're taking a look at the RTX 2060 Super. Unlike the RTX 2060 which launched about 6 months before, this has an increased core count, increased memory bandwidth, and of course we get 8 gigs of GDDR6 as opposed to just 6. This is probably going to hold up a lot better in 2023 and beyond, but today we'll be seeing how it does in a handful of modern and popular titles. Now if someone were to ask me would I recommend an RTX 2060 Super in 2023, I'd say, well, take a look at the prices of RX 6600s from AMD where you live, because performance will be similar and the costs may very well be lower. Plus you can find those brand new, whereas these are all second hand these days. That said, if you want DLSS and I'm assuming better ray tracing, then this might be the more sensible option, but I think that's probably a comparison for another day. Today then the focus is solely on this. The model we have here is, well actually I don't know what model it is. I plugged it into my computer, opened up GPU-Z and it just told me it was from PC Partner. So I'm thinking that it probably came from a Lenovo pre-built or an Asus pre-built, something like that, but I typed in the serial number in Google and literally nothing came up, so yeah. It's stock, basically, all the speeds are stock. I like the look of the card, I just don't really know what machine it's from, so there's that, but everything is pretty much normal in terms of the clock speeds, the boost speeds, and it operates well within reasonable temperatures. The fans don't stop on this mystery model, however, so they're constantly spinning, but it's still pretty quiet at idle. So let's get into a few games. 1080p and 1440p has been tested today and see how this thing holds up. So what I'm going to do is run through the 1080p results first, because I think in those more demanding titles, those newer games, this is definitely the ideal resolution, albeit at higher settings. You can certainly push the graphical options when using this card in demanding games, like Cyberpunk for example here. We're using the high crowds, high textures and the high preset overall, and the result was pretty good. When it came to the gameplay, 73 FPS on average with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 48, so really not bad at all in terms of these figures. And if you wanted a higher frame rate, you could indeed drop things. The beauty of PC gaming is of course that you can choose the settings and resolution and the frame rates that you want to target. Probably the most demanding game on today's tested list is The Last of Us. 1080p here with the high preset. The only thing I changed was turn SSR or screen space reflections off, as this does give us a little bit of a frame rate boost. I'd certainly suggest a lower preset if you want to try and keep those percentile numbers above 60, but I always like to try and target a nice balance of visual quality and performance, and I think with the high settings here we were just about doing that. I've sort of pushed the card to the max here in terms of what I'd play at anyway. Here we were seeing 64 FPS with a solid 1% low, but there were a few little dips and drops here and there. I'm sure the 8 gigs of VRAM is definitely helping, however. Marvel Spider-Man up next, 1080p with the very high preset, TAA enabled 2. Nothing else has been changed within the preset here. Ray traced reflections were off. I haven't tested any ray tracing today because I think a card like this, using one in 2023, I don't think it's really worth it. Not unless you're using DLSS or FSR in combination with ray tracing of course, but it's up to you. 105 FPS on average probably meant that we could have turned RT reflections on, but there we go. The percentile lows were also pretty solid. Elden Ring, as you know, is capped at 60 FPS, and for this one I decided to go for the maximum preset. The only thing I turned off as always were motion blur and depth of field, options that I turn off in every tested game. Here we hit the cap of 60 FPS and we saw solid percentile lows too. Nothing to complain about with this game using this card at 1080p. Hogwarts Legacy is another demanding title here at 1080p. We were using high preset with TAA also set to high, nothing else was changed. 67 FPS was the average, and as usual with Nvidia cards, at least in my experience, the percentile lows did suffer a little bit. The frame times and the frame time graph, as you can see here, was a bit all over the place, but I tend to get this when I'm using any Nvidia GPU. Not sure why, but I think this game just prefers AMD hardware, at least from what I've seen. The Witcher 3 Next Gen next in DX12 mode, of course, at 1080p. I went with the Ultra preset, Hairworks was off, SSR or screen space reflections were turned down to low because these can be quite intensive, although as you're about to see by the frame rate, we probably could have turned these options up a bit. TAAU was also enabled. 104 FPS on average with a 1% low of 65 and a 0.1% low of 39 meant that the experience was a very solid one, even in and around busier areas. Red Dead Redemption 2 up next, with the ultra textures, and everything else was set to mostly high. All the options that had an on-off toggle were probably off, things like long shadows. You can see the options on screen here. This combination of settings should make the game look and play really nicely. Into the gameplay then, an 85 was the average with a 1% low of a very nice 69 and 0.1% low of 55. This was holding up really well. Modern Warfare 2 up next, which can be really demanding, especially with the level I tested, which was the hydroelectric level, ultra preset here. With this preset, the anti-aliasing does usually default to filmic SMAA, but I turn this down to just normal SMAA, and I turn off depth of field as a personal preference. 92 FPS was the average with a 1% low of 68 and a 0.1% low of 45. I'd say for online competitive play, just like in every multiplayer game, you're probably better off using lower settings to maximise your frame rates, but you can certainly push things to ultra if you want to. Now let's cover the 1440p results. With Cyberpunk, we have the high crowds, high textures, and the low preset. I had to go with low this time around in order to hit at least 68 FPS, but I kept the crowds at high because this makes Night City feel more alive. In the gameplay, 68 was the average, followed by a solid percentile low of 52 and a 0.1% low of 47. So again, not much to worry about here. And the RTX 2060 Super, although best suited to 1080p, can still very much handle 1440p gaming, albeit with more of a sacrifice to the settings as expected. With The Last of Us, we had to drop things down to low, not very low, luckily just low, and I still think the game looks okay. Nothing else was changed with these settings. I simply selected the low preset and then jumped into the same level as before. The average FPS was 61, so just about over 60 FPS here, with some solid percentile low, so no dips or drops to speak of really with this card when using these visual options. For Spider-Man, I dropped things to the high preset with nothing else changed and enabled TAA at 1440p. I think once again we probably could have enabled some RT reflections, but I don't really feel it's necessary, nor does it add that much to the game in my opinion. 83 was the average frame rate, followed by 62 and 56 respectively, so again a very nice experience when it came to Spider-Man on the 2060 Super. Elden Ring, once again, caps out at 60 FPS of course. 1440p this time I went with a higher preset instead of maximum. During the maximum test, we were hitting the cap a lot, but there were certainly a few more dips to the mid-50s. To alleviate this, I simply dropped down to high, kept the motion blur and depth of field settings off, and the average was 60, followed again by some solid percentile low. So no real issues here with Elden Ring at 1440p on the 2060 Super. Hogwarts Legacy once again 1440p, this time with the medium preset. I've also turned the TAA option down to low. In the gameplay, 65 was the average, which was better than I thought, to be honest. I certainly thought we'd see an average that was just less than 60. The percentile lows seemed to smooth out a little bit here, as opposed to the 1080p results. The game felt a lot smoother to play and the frame time graph was a lot more consistent as well, whereas before it was a bit more all over the place. The Witcher 3, I actually kept the same settings, which I thought was a bit of a push, as I did at 1080p. Same ultra preset, HBAO+, screen space reflections at low, and TAAU enabled. We just about saw over 60 FPS even in the busiest areas here. In fact, the game averaged out at 67, and the percentile lows were also pretty good. I certainly recommend dropping things to high though, I think, with this card at this resolution, but this was still certainly more than playable, in my opinion. Red Dead Redemption 2 once again, we kept the ultra textures here, which the 8 gigs of VRAM allows us to do within the settings. Instead of high, I dropped everything else down to mostly medium, but I kept the TAA level at medium as well. Here we saw 72 frames per second with a 1% low of 60 and a 0.1% low of 52, so no issues to speak of with Red Dead. And at this resolution, things are sharpened up a little bit. Everything looks really nice here. I'd argue that it looks just as good as it did before, with everything else mostly set to high. And I think with the average frame rate, we're getting a very playable experience. Finally then, it's Modern Warfare 2 at 1440p. I dropped the preset to balanced. I think you'd probably want to drop things a little bit more, especially in those more demanding maps like the hydroelectric level once again here. 66 was the average this time around, with a few problems in terms of that 0.1% low, but overall the experience was a decent one. I'd probably go with low, or at least turn a few things down a bit more, but as I said before, I like to try and push the cards that I test to their limits in terms of trying to find a balance between visual quality and performance, and I think we've done that here. Now in the next one, we'll probably be comparing the 2060 Super to the 4060. That's something I've been wondering about, and I think we'll also do a 6600 comparison as well, just to see how this holds up. But this has been a look at the 2060 Super in 2023, still going strong, but I'd certainly recommend looking at the prices of 6600s where you live, especially if you don't care about ray tracing or DLSS. Don't forget that AMD cards have FSR anyway as well, so bear that in mind. That's all for this one then. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.